My name is Vex912, and I used to think I was smart. Ha! What a joke that turned out to be. 300 cycles of military experience, graduated top of my class from the Galactic Command Academy, and here I am, sitting in what used to be my flagship, watching these humans completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about warfare. Let me back up a bit. You see, when the Devourers first appeared at the edge of our galaxy, every civilized species did exactly what any sane being would do. We ran. Fast. The Zephyrians, with their 1,000-year military tradition? Gone faster than you could say, tactical retreat. The Molten Cores, who'd been bragging about their impenetrable defense systems for decades? They didn't even bother sending a goodbye message, and honestly, I didn't blame them. The Devourers weren't just another hostile species. These things consumed entire star systems for breakfast, turning planets into cosmic dust and using solar energy like we use water. Their ships were the size of moons, their weapons could crack continents, and they had this delightful habit of absorbing the technology of every species they encountered. So when the emergency session of the Galactic Council convened, the vote was unanimous. Well, almost unanimous. 47 species voted to evacuate to the Andromeda Galaxy. One species voted to stay and fight. Guess which one? Are you absolutely certain about this decision? I asked Captain Elena Vasquez, the human representative who'd somehow become the de facto leader of what everyone was calling the Last Stand. She was sitting across from me in the council chamber, her dark eyes showing absolutely zero fear. Zero. I'd seen seasoned warriors wet themselves at the mere mention of the Devourers, and this human was sipping something called coffee like we were discussing the weather. Oh, we're certain, she replied, that infuriating human smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Though I appreciate your concern, Admiral Vex. Really, it's touching. Sarcasm. Of course. Because when facing extinction, what you really need is a species that treats everything like a joke. Captain Vasquez, I tried again, my voice taking on what I hoped was a reasonable tone. Perhaps you don't fully understand the scale of what's approaching. The Devourers have consumed 17 galaxies. Their smallest vessels are larger than your biggest cities. They've never been defeated, not once, in over 10,000 years of expansion. She leaned back in her chair, completely relaxed. You know what I find funny about that, Admiral? What? Nobody's ever actually tried to fight them. The silence in the chamber was deafening. I could practically hear my own circulatory system pumping. That's because fighting them is suicide. Maybe. She shrugged. But running away is definitely defeat. At least fighting gives us a chance. A chance at what? Dying gloriously? A chance at winning. I stared at her. We all did. The remaining representatives from the few species brave enough to attend this final session just sat there, mandibles agape, tentacles twitching, various other anatomical features expressing universal disbelief. Captain, I said slowly, with all due respect to your species' apparent death wish, the mathematics simply don't work. You have 300 ships. They have 300,000. Your weapons are chemical-based projectiles and primitive energy beams. Theirs can ignite stars. She nodded thoughtfully. And yet, here we are, the only species that's ever said no to them. Don't you find that interesting? Before I could respond, the massive displays around the chamber lit up with proximity alerts. The Devourers had arrived at the outer rim of our galaxy, right on schedule. Their fleet was massive, didn't begin to cover it. It looked like someone had decided to relocate a small galaxy and forgot to mention it to anyone. Evacuation transports are standing by, announced General Korth, his usually steady voice cracking just a bit. Final boarding call for all species. One by one, the representatives stood and filed out. Some offered apologetic looks, others couldn't even make eye contact. I started to rise myself, then noticed Captain Vasquez hadn't moved. Aren't you coming? I asked. Where? To the evacuation ships. She looked genuinely confused. Why would I do that? Because in approximately 72 hours, this entire galaxy is going to be nothing but space dust. Probably not, she said, pulling out a small device and checking something on its screen. My people are already moving into position. Should be quite the show. I sat back down. Hard. Position for what? The fight, obviously. What fight? You can't fight the Devourers. Says who? Says every military expert in known space. Ah. She nodded sagely. And how many of those experts have actually studied human military history? What does that have to do with anything? Captain Vasquez stood up, finally showing some animation. Admiral, let me tell you about a little thing we call the underdog advantage. Throughout our history, we've made a bit of a specialty out of beating opponents who were bigger, stronger, and better equipped than us. It's kind of our thing. That's completely different. You're talking about fighting other humans. Sometimes. Sometimes we fought nature itself. Storms, floods, ice ages, plagues, you name it. The thing is, Admiral, we've learned something that apparently the rest of the galaxy hasn't. Which is? The bigger they are, the harder they fall. I was about to explain exactly how ridiculous that sounded when alarms started blaring throughout the station. The Devourers weren't waiting the expected 72 hours. They were accelerating their approach, and their lead ships would be here in 6 hours. Final evacuation call. General Korth's voice echoed through the corridors. All personnel to evacuation stations immediately. Captain Vasquez checked her device again. Perfect timing. My people should be in position any minute now. What position? I practically yelled. Where are your ships? I don't see any human vessels on the scanner. She grinned. Actually grinned. That's because you're looking in the wrong place. The wrong place? Where else would ships be except in space? Oh, they're in space all right. Just not where you'd expect them. Before I could demand a clearer answer, Lieutenant Torres burst into the chamber. Captain. Operation Trojan is go. All teams report ready. Excellent. Captain Vasquez turned to me. Admiral, you might want to stay for this. Consider it a learning experience. Stay? Stay for what? To watch 300 human ships take on the largest invasion force in galactic history. That's not bravery, Captain. That's insanity. In our experience, she said, heading for the door, there's often very little difference between the two. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the chamber with a choice. Run with the rest of the galaxy, or stay and watch the human species commit the most spectacular suicide in recorded history that I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get to the nearest evacuation ship and put as much distance as possible between myself and the approaching nightmare. But something about Captain Vasquez's confidence, that absolute certainty in her voice, made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was professional obligation. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the tiny, impossible hope that these crazy humans might actually know something the rest of us didn't. Either way, I found myself walking to the observation deck instead of the evacuation bay. If I was going to die, I might as well have a good view. The Devourer fleet was visible now, a dark cloud of ships stretching across half the visible sky. Their largest vessels were easily the size of small planets, and there were hundreds of them. The smaller ones, which were still massive by any reasonable standard, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and somewhere out there, 300 human ships were getting ready to face them. I activated the communication array, hoping to at least listen in on what were surely going to be humanity's final transmissions. Instead, I heard something I wasn't expecting: laughter. Bravo team, you see those big ugly ones on the left flank? Copy that, Alpha. We see them. Bit overdressed for the party, aren't they? Just wait until they see what we brought as party favors. Party favors? They were talking about party favors while facing the most dangerous force in the known universe? All teams, this is command. Remember, we're not trying to win a conventional battle here. We're trying to prove a point. What point is that? I muttered to myself. As if she'd heard me, Captain Vasquez's voice came over the comm. The point, Admiral Vex, is that sometimes the best way to win is to change the rules entirely. I realized I'd accidentally activated the response channel. Captain? What are you talking about? Where are your ships? Look closer, Admiral. Not at space. At the Devourers themselves. I adjusted the scanner array, focusing on the approaching fleet. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just the same massive, terrifying vessels that had consumed countless worlds. Then, slowly, I began to notice something odd: small energy signatures. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Moving around in between the Devourer ships like tiny insects around sleeping giants. Those aren't ships, I breathed. Those are boarding parties, Captain Vasquez finished. 300 ships, Admiral. But not the kind of ships you were expecting. As I watched in growing amazement and horror, the tiny human craft began attaching themselves to the Devourer vessels. Not attacking from the outside, where the massive ship's weapons and defenses were strongest, but preparing to fight from the inside, where no one in their right mind would ever think to go. You're insane, I whispered. Probably, came the cheerful reply. But we're about to find out if insane works better than running away. The first explosions lit up the void like deadly fireworks, and I realized that the real battle was just beginning. What happened next defied every principle of space combat I'd learned in my 3 centuries of military service. The humans weren't just boarding the Devourer ships, they were doing it while the massive vessels were still in formation, still moving at incredible speeds, still completely unaware that anything was wrong. How in the 7 hells did they get past the detection grids? I found myself asking the empty observation deck. Simple, Captain Vasquez's voice crackled through the comm. We didn't try to hide from their sensors. We hid inside their own ships. That's impossible. Admiral, you really need to expand your definition of impossible. My people have been practicing this maneuver for months using abandoned Zephyrian freighters. Turns out, when you make your ships big enough to swallow planets, you create a lot of blind spots. On the scanner, I watched as the first Devourer vessel suddenly lurched sideways, its massive engine sputtering. Then another. Then a dozen more. The perfect formation of the invasion fleet began to wobble like a drunk Morvanian after shore leave. What are they doing to those ships? Oh, you know, came Lieutenant Torres's voice, barely audible over what sounded like explosions and weapons fire, just a little interior redecorating. These things are uglier inside than they are outside, if you can believe that. You're fighting inside their ships? Fighting's a strong word, replied another human voice I didn't recognize. More like aggressive renovation. Hey Captain, you were right about the central power cores. They really don't like it when you introduce human-made explosives to their quantum matrix thingies. I stared at the tactical display in growing disbelief. The largest Devourer vessel, the one that had been leading the formation, was now spinning helplessly as its engines fired in random directions. They're taking control of the ships from the inside. Not all of them, Captain Vasquez replied, her voice remarkably calm considering she was presumably in the middle of a firefight. Some of these things are just too big to fully control. But we don't need to control them. We just need to turn them into very expensive paperweights. Another massive explosion lit up space as one of the Devourer vessels simply split in half, its own weapons turning inward and tearing it apart from within. The debris cloud was so large it took out 3 smaller ships that had been following too closely. Oops, came a cheerful human voice. That one was bigger than we thought. Jenkins, did you just accidentally destroy 4 enemy vessels with 1 bomb? Accidentally? Admiral, I'm hurt. That was completely intentional. Well, mostly intentional. The fourth one was a happy surprise. I couldn't help it. Despite everything, despite the absolute impossibility of what I was witnessing, I started to laugh. Not because it was funny, though the humans' casual attitude toward galactic-scale destruction was admittedly amusing. No, I was laughing because I was watching the most feared force in the universe being systematically dismantled by 300 ships that were apparently crewed by lunatics. Admiral Vex, Captain Vasquez's voice interrupted my nervous breakdown, might want to pay attention to the big one in the center. That's their command ship, and it's about to get very upset. She was right. The massive vessel at the heart of the Devourer fleet, easily the size of Earth's moon, was beginning to glow with a terrible energy. Weapon ports that could level continents were opening along its hull. They're charging their main batteries, I reported, my training kicking in despite my shock. Captain, your people need to get out of there. Those weapons can destroy entire solar systems. Yeah, we figured that might happen, came the reply. That's why we saved the best for last. Torres, you and your team in position? Copy that, Captain. We're right where we need to be. What's your location? Oh, just hanging out in their main reactor core. Nice and cozy down here. Bit warm, though. My blood went cold. They're inside the main reactor? That's suicide. Only if we don't do this right, Lieutenant Torres replied. And Admiral, we humans have a saying about doing things right the first time. Which is? We usually don't. Before I could process the implications of that terrifying statement, the command ship's main weapons fired. The energy discharge was so massive it briefly outshone the local star. The beam lanced out toward where the human boarding craft had originally been detected, turning several million cubic kilometers of empty space into superheated plasma, except there was nothing there to hit. Did they just waste their main battery on empty space? I asked. Afraid so, Captain Vasquez replied. Funny thing about fighting an enemy that's never faced real opposition before. They don't really know how to adapt when their usual tactics don't work. That's when the command ship exploded, not the small, controlled explosions I'd been watching as the humans systematically disabled the other vessels. This was something else entirely. The massive ship simply came apart in a chain reaction of devastating proportions, each detonation triggering the next in a cascade of destruction that consumed the entire vessel in less than 30 seconds. The shockwave was so intense it knocked out half the instruments on my observation deck. When the sensors came back online, where the command ship had been, there was nothing but an expanding cloud of debris and energy. Torres, report. Captain Vasquez's voice cut through the static. Still here, Captain. Though I think we may have used slightly more explosives than necessary. How much more? Well, let's just say the locals are going to see some pretty fireworks for the next few decades. I looked at the tactical display with new understanding. The explosion hadn't just destroyed the command ship. The debris field was spreading outward, taking out dozens of smaller Devourer vessels that hadn't been able to get clear in time. And the energy pulse from the reactor core detonation was causing cascade failures in ships across the entire fleet. You didn't just board their ships, I said quietly. You turned their own fleet into a weapon against itself. Now you're getting it, Admiral, Captain Vasquez replied. The thing about building ships the size of planets is that when they blow up, they tend to take a lot of other things with them. Across the entire Devourer formation, vessels were exploding, colliding, or simply going dark as their systems failed. The perfectly organized invasion fleet was collapsing into chaos, and at the center of it all, 300 tiny human craft were zipping between the wreckage like deadly insects, finishing off anything that looked like it might still be functional. This is impossible, I muttered. You can't defeat a force this size with boarding parties and explosives. Admiral, came a new voice, older and more serious than the others. This is Commander Sarah Martinez, Overall Mission Commander. Permission to share something with you? Granted. You keep saying this is impossible. But you're looking at it wrong. We didn't defeat the Devourers in spite of their size and strength. We defeated them because of their size and strength. I don't understand. They built their entire strategy around being unstoppable. Massive ships, overwhelming firepower, perfect formations. But that only works if your enemy tries to fight you on your terms. The moment someone changes the rules, all that size and strength becomes a liability. As if to prove her point, another explosion rippled through the Devourer fleet as one of their damaged vessels crashed into two others, creating a chain reaction that consumed an entire wing of their formation. Every species that faced them tried to match their firepower, Commander Martinez continued. Nobody ever thought to just walk up and knock on the door. Walk up and knock on the door. It's a human expression, Admiral. Sometimes the direct approach works better than the complicated one. I watched the scanner as the last functional Devourer vessels began to retreat, their perfect formation reduced to scattered survivors fleeing for the edge of the galaxy. The unstoppable force that had consumed 17 galaxies was running away from 300 human ships and a bunch of homemade explosives. Captain Vasquez, I said finally, I owe you an apology. For what? For thinking you were insane. Oh, we are insane, Admiral. Completely, certifiably crazy. But sometimes crazy is exactly what the situation calls for. As the human ships regrouped and began the long journey back to base, I found myself sending an emergency message to the evacuation fleets. The galaxy was safe. The Devourers were beaten. And it was all thanks to a species that apparently specialized in doing the impossible just to prove it could be done. Admiral, Captain Vasquez's voice came over the comm one last time, there's something else you should know. What's that? This was just a scouting force. The main Devourer fleet is still out there, somewhere in deep space. My heart sank. You mean this isn't over? Oh, it's over for this bunch. But the others? Well, let's just say we humans have a lot more ideas about interior decorating. And despite everything, despite the implications of what she just told me, I found myself smiling. Because for the first time in galactic history, someone had looked at an unstoppable force and decided to stop it anyway. The humans were insane, reckless, and completely unpredictable. Thank the stars they were on our side. As I filed my report with Galactic Command, I made sure to include a recommendation. The next time the universe faced an impossible threat, maybe we should ask the humans for advice before we started running. After all, they seem to have this whole impossible thing figured out.